Ever catch yourself wondering, what if you could actually see trust? Like, witness it happening in the brain, especially when it comes to how we react to robots.
Okay, now that's an image.
Right. Well, turns out it's not as sci-fi as it sounds. And it's a big deal as we've got these cobots, collaborative robots, working right alongside us more and more.
Yeah, no more robots safely behind cages. That changes the trust game for sure.
Totally. So we're diving deep into a study, just came out in January this year. Hopko, Zhang, and their team over at Texas A&M. They got really clever with how they looked at how our brains handle robots that, well, aren't always so reliable.
Which, let's face it, most of us who've used any tech have experienced.
Oh, for sure. But that's what's so cool. We're not just talking about robots in general. It's that moment trust cracks, even if it's a machine we're talking about. So think of this deep dive as our way to unpack not just what they found, but why it matters if you're into, well, humans, tech, and that sometimes fragile thing called trust.
Definitely a timely combo.
Absolutely. Okay, so picture this. You've got 38 people, most totally new to hanging out with robots, right? Their task is to build this kind of complex planetary gear system.
Don't worry, you don't need to be an engineer to follow along.
Exactly. It's more that it takes some real focus and working together, not your average build. And their coworker in all this is this UR10 collaborative robot.
Which is key here, right? We're talking robots designed to be right there with us, not tucked away, so that trust element is even more crucial.
100%. So first part of the study, the robot's basically the perfect partner, handing off parts, smooth as can be.
Got to establish that baseline, see how the brain acts when the robot's doing what it's supposed to.
Makes sense. But then part two, they shake things up.
Ah, the trust fall. Or maybe the trust fail moment.
Exactly. Sometimes it's slow, other times it mixes stuff up, even drops something now and then, like, oops.
It's like when your usually reliable buddy suddenly seems off, you can't help but wonder what's going on.
Right. And here's where this study gets really neat. They didn't just watch people's reactions. They wanted to see inside what happened in the brain when that robot let them down.
Because so much of how we study trust, especially with tech, it's surveys, self-reporting, which has its limits.
It's like trying to explain what chocolate tastes like if someone's never had it. Close, but not quite there.
Exactly. People don't always have the words, or they might not even realize what's influencing them. So, Texas A&M team, they brought the big guns tech-wise. FNIRS brain imaging and eye tracking glasses.
It's time for a bit of a tech breakdown. FNIRS, that's functional near-infrared spectroscopy, sounds intense.
It's actually pretty cool. Think of it like a gentler, more portable fMRI. It uses light to see blood flow changes in the brain as it's happening. So you get a peek into what areas are lighting up when, say, the robot starts acting wonky.
So we're seeing their thoughts in action, kind of.
In a way, yeah. And the eye tracking, that's even more detail. Not just where someone looks, but for how long, even those tiny movements we don't think about.
So if they're staring at the robot like, what did you just DO? The glasses catch that.
Exactly. And put that together with the brain scans. Much richer picture of how trust, or the lack of it, plays out in our minds and bodies than we usually get. It's like peeking into someone's head without them saying a word, really something.
Wild, right? But, okay, let's talk about what they actually found. How do our brains act when a robot drops a ball, so to speak?
Well, the study backed up something we probably all know deep down. When tech fails us, our trust goes down too.
Not exactly shocking, but...
But it goes deeper than just confirming the obvious. What's really cool is they teased out how that broken trust messes with how we think too.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
So there's this thing called situation awareness, right? Basically how in control you feel of what you're doing. Turns out, when the robot got flaky, people's perception of their own awareness went down, even if they were still doing the task just fine objectively.
Wait, so even if they weren't messing up more, they felt less sure of themselves just because the robot was?
Exactly. It's like the robot being unreliable made them doubt themselves, even if their skills hadn't actually changed.
Wow, that's something else. And this wasn't just a feeling, right? This was showing up in their brains.
Oh yeah. That fancy FNIRS data showed when the robot went off script, there was less connectivity in a specific part. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the right side, if you want to get technical.
And that's important because... Remind me why we care about the prefrontal cortex again?
Think of it as the brain's executive suite. Planning, decisions, complex thought, all that good stuff. Less connection there, it's like disrupting the brain's ability to do its best work. you know?
So not only does the unreliable robot make them feel less confident, it's like their brain's ability to even handle the situation well takes a hit too.
Exactly. And it's in those moments where the brain's having to work harder, we see some interesting differences between how men and women are reacting, actually.
Here we go. This is where I think it gets even more interesting. Because it's not just people reacting to robots, but men and women might not experience it the same way.
Right. And what's wild is, before the robot even acted up, women in this study were consistently reporting they felt like the workload was higher, physically more demanding compared to the guys.
Which honestly tracks with a lot of research out there, right? How even if a task is supposed to be neutral, women often shoulder more or experience it differently.
For sure. But what this study adds is, how might that already existing difference play out when you throw a robot into the mix, especially one that breaks that trust?
So was it that the higher perceived workload for women, did that make them more thrown off by the robot failing? Or were they maybe better able to roll with it because their brains were already in high gear?
That's the thing. The study hints it might be more the second one.
Hmm.
See, the men, they had this stronger initial trust in the robot, kind of like their default was to believe it do its thing. When that went out the window, their brains and how well they did on the task, it showed more disruption.
So almost like the guys were more surprised by the robot messing up, while the women, maybe because they were already more on alert, were less thrown off by it.
That's a way to put it. And it makes you realize we got to be thinking about these differences when we're making robots to be used in the real world, right? Can't just be one size fits all for trust, especially when our brains tick differently like this.
It's like we're peeking behind the curtain of how we interact with these machines in a whole new way, and this is really just the beginning.
Totally. Like, we've been trying to solve this equation, but missing half the variables. This study gives us a glimpse of those hidden pieces, the brain stuff, the psychology, all feeding into how we handle tech.
And those pieces matter more as robots go from factory floors to, well, everywhere.
Right. Like, if we can literally see trust breaking down in the brain, shouldn't that inform how we design robots in the first place?
Now that is a thought. Robots that are better at signaling, hey, I'm not perfect, so we don't expect too much.
Maybe. And it might not even be just how they work, but how they look, too. This study, that was a pretty standard robot arm. What if it's more human-like? Do we trust more or less? Does it get weird?
It's like that thing with special effects, right? Too real, but not quite, and it's creepy, not comforting.
Exactly. Whole other layer of complexity there, how our culture shapes what we think a robot should be.
Makes you wonder, how do we even prepare for a future where they're just around? If busted trust, even in a lab, does this to our brains, shouldn't that be part of the conversation about designing them, using them, even the rules around it?
100%. We're so focused on what robots can do, but the psychology, the ethics of it all, when they're in our workplaces, homes, even just hanging out.
Yeah, it's a lot, but important stuff as we step into this unknown territory.
You know, what strikes me is this study highlights something we forget in all the tech hype.
What's that?
Robots, no matter how fancy, are still things made by humans, for humans. And understanding the human brain, how we trust or don't, that's just as vital as the code and sensors inside them.
It's that reminder, even in the AI age, it's still our intelligence that decides how this all goes down.
Well said. And on a more personal note, it validates something we kind of already feel, you know.
Oh, how so?
That gut feeling we have about whether to trust someone or something. It's not just air. There's real biology behind it. That hesitation, that unease, our brain's always assessing, reacting, even when we don't realize it.
So trust your gut, you're saying?
To a point, yeah. But trust your brain, too, to learn to navigate this world where tech's only getting more intertwined with everything.
It's a wild dance between our instincts and all this new knowledge. As we wrap up, I gotta say, I'm kind of in awe of the brain, how complex it is, how it keeps adapting.
Me too. Who knows? Maybe someday we'll have a co-host who can give us the robot perspective on all this.
As long as they don't try to take over the show, right? But seriously, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into trust, tech, and the incredible human brain.
My pleasure. Always a good conversation. Until next time, everyone, stay curious.